I think that longevity of 150 years is a faith and a belief that the work of the college has purpose, that we go right back to St. Benedict 1500 years ago, and a commitment that community and the whole person and the development of the whole person in context is essential to a good life. And good lives make a good world. There's no doubt in the history of Rosebank that there is the work of something beyond all of us. And that work has inspired people.
The ethos of Rosebank grew out of the need in the 1850s and 1860s to provide a quiet place for the formation of the Young Sisters of the Good Samaritan.
The sisters were founded by Archbishop John Bede Paulding and Mother Scholastica Gibbons, originally to care for the women and children on the streets of Sydney.
In 1867, a community of Good Samaritan sisters had opened a school a little way up the road in modern-day Concord and were working and teaching up there. It was a colonial house that had been built most likely in the 1840s. It was sufficiently out of Sydney to be fairly quiet, surrounded by rose hedges, hence the name Rosebank. Shortly afterwards, in mid-1868, there was a notice advertising for auction a property upon which we now sit today. That property was subsequently bought, and the sisters at what was then Albina Villa up in Concord moved down here to what we know as Rosebank. So that's how the school began.
In the 1800s, women just didn't receive the same education as men. The idea that if you are a poor family living out in the middle of Australia, you've only got enough money to send one person to school, you're going to send your son, not your daughter, because your son can go and work and get a job and then look after you in your old age, whereas your daughter can't because women weren't in the workforce and so on. But what was really important about Rosebank is it was one of the few schools in this period which said that the education of women was as important as the education of men.
There's a sense here at Rosebank through even the earliest graduates that a woman's place was not to be limited by what the social norms of colonial New South Wales had set. And so we have, right from the very beginning, women achieving well, women achieving highly.
So Mother Marcella Kenny, one of the early graduates from Rosebank College, and she went on to become Mother General of the Good Samaritans in her later life. She was among the first women to go to the University of Sydney and to study there.
She had this great love of learning, which she instilled into the young sisters that were coming forward, so that they maintained a high level of education.
One of the often unsung heroes of the Rosebank story is Mother Scholastica Gibbons, the co-founder of the sisters. There was a sense of people were in the presence of someone truly sacred, truly holy. She is very much the mother of Rosebank, and we're delighted that a sculpture of her now sits outside Downside Hall. The sisters opened the school here at Rosebank with the objective of providing a quality education for young women, young ladies, and that's continued that tradition ever since.
As Mother Berchmans McLaughlin, who was the principal in about the 1890s, said that the story of education is the story of increasing equality of opportunity.
At Rosebank and in all our schools, because the sisters also lived on site, the chapel is at the heart of the college. It was the place where the sisters prayed, and in the early years, the boarders were like little sisters in terms of how they lived their lives.
Their uniform would probably have been a basic dark navy dress with a pinafore. And we have some early photos from the late 1890s and early 1900s which show the girls wearing these enormous bonnets that I don't think any girl at Rosebank today would be seen dead wearing, but they were quite common back then.
A typical day would have been early rise, mass, prayers. They would have said lots of prayers. Their whole curriculum would have been built around the spiritual life, the religious education of the students. The fig tree here at Rosebank was here before they came, and I think the tree is a great symbol for our own lives and for the education here, because, branches fall off and die, but new seeds emerge and new growth is brought. So I think a tree does have that nurturing symbol of longevity, but also of new life.
Rosebank's longevity is linked again back into its Benedictine ethos, that is of being adaptable to the times in which we live.
The Benedictine approach to education has always been meeting people where they are. It's this idea of openness, which I think is at the heart of how Rosebank graduates went out into the world. So on one hand, we've got famous writers who've come out, or successful tennis players, musicians who in the years before World War I travelled the world, all through Europe and America, spreading this Benedictine education ideal. But on the other hand, we've got the reputation of the college growing through the roundedness, the flourishing of its graduates. So people who maybe haven't headlined in the newspapers aren't being praised for achieving great things and founding colleges and so on, but they're living their lives according to the Rosebank ideal, in that they're well-rounded individuals.
The graduates from Rosebank have been really quite extraordinarily successful. At the beginning of the 20th century, you have someone who decides to do medicine at Sydney University. This lady was Mary Burford Williams. She discovers the business of pathology. She discovers by reading about what people are doing overseas and then doing experiments herself. And so she sets up here in Sydney at Lewisham Hospital the first pathology laboratory. Now, that sort of ex-student is replicated as you go along in the field of music. Lots of people who become teachers, of course, because that was a field that was socially acceptable for girls. A heck of a lot did nursing, and so we end up with the first woman brigadier in the Australian Army because she was in charge of the nursing corps.
Rosebank was not separate from the Australia of the 1890s, the early 1900s, and then of course into the First World War. It differed quite dramatically from the impact of the First World War on all boys' schools, where there was a much greater emphasis placed on doing your duty and joining up. That wasn't the case here. Duty for the girls would have been to write letters to the soldiers at the front, to knit socks and that sort of thing.
It's the period after World War I that we start to see the effects of the war on Rosebank College.
It was simply financially beyond the limited means of many families to keep their girls at school. In an age when people still believed that, well, what was the point of girls getting an education to start with? Yes, get them to read and write, do some basic domestic learning, that sort of thing. But after that, no, what are they going to do? Most of them will go off to marry and have children and become mothers.
The way Rosebank responded to the drop in women's education following World War I was to reiterate their teaching mission.
There is a strong history in Rosebank as well as within our other colleges that if families are going through tough time, the school can carry a student. School fees are exempt or uniforms are provided. The sisters always found a way through.
Later on, so in the 20s and 30s, with donations from alumni, now the college has been going for a long time, we've got more alumni, they started providing scholarships to many of the girls. So one girl who was here during this period, Sister Marcia McMahon, was here entirely on a scholarship. So her parents didn't pay anything and she came here, boarded, had all of her meals paid for and all of her education because they couldn't afford to have her educated. And she lived far out in a town where there was no parish school for free for her to educate. Part of the effects of World War I is that women went out into the workforce more. So this meant that many of them left school earlier, which had dropping numbers in school to go out and work. But it also meant then that girls now needed more commercial, more business-focused skills than they might have needed previously. And we see this influencing Rosebank in the introduction of the commercial subjects, as they were called. Bookkeeping, accounting, typing, secretarial work, so very much the work that women were doing in the period. The fact that Rosebank introduces it quite early on, again, shows that they're reacting to the needs of the populace and the needs of their people.
I think that speaks of the integrity of the school, of facing the challenges of the day honestly, looking backwards to where the school has come from and its origins, and looking forward to where the school can and will go. There's a level of flexibility within the whole ethos of the school that allows it to do this in an almost seamless manner.
Rosebank's been around for 150 years because I feel that all the students and all the people that have been here have contributed something great, something special, and something lasting.
As the Second World War came along,
some pupils were sent here for safety.
In the dormitories on the veranda where we slept, watching the searchlights going over, and we had an air raid shelter here, of course.
You know, the bell would go and you'd all have to line up, and we did it so meticulously.
We had to go downstairs to the dining room with these huge tables, and we'd go under those with our pillow and blanket.
We never had a real air raid. You know, it was just air raid drill. But we would have done it perfectly.
The decision to turn the school into a junior was sort of kept a little bit secret in a way, and it was even from, I think, the principal at the time.
That was all very upsetting. Again, when the time came, we were told that the school was closing.
A number of religious congregations was being set up for girls who thought they'd be interested in becoming sisters.
Every school in New South Wales that wants to send students for exams, public examinations, which were in those days the intermediate certificate after 3 years and the leaving certificate after 5 years, had to have the accreditation of the government. The order, to their great credit, realised that they needed to keep that because the school had still to function as a school, but for a much smaller body of people. And that was the girls who were thinking of joining the order.
It was in the days when, you know, there were millions of vocations. Everyone wanted to be a nun, and so they were getting them educated early so they'd be able to walk into teaching.
The more qualified these students were, the better for the quality of education that they could offer as a nun in the Order of the Good Samaritans.
Then we found out after we'd left and that only 11 nuns came to live in this big, huge place. So that's why it really wasn't feasible, this huge area for 11 girls.
When the war had come to an end, there was a request from Japan to found a college for girls. The Good Samaritans had this attitude that if something needed to be done, then they should move heaven and earth to come to the help of that community that needed help.
It was about being real and being in touch with what was happening around you. And that's Benedictine.
There was no question of the fact that they were in a different society with a different religious basis, and it certainly wasn't Christian, but that didn't matter. They were going to offer what they could offer.
When we arrived in Australia, I certainly didn't know a word of English. It was just a case of sitting in the class, the two of us, and listening. The sister used to always say, hands up the girls who haven't finished copying from the board. And, the first time it meant nothing, the second time nothing, and then maybe one time I'd see hands go up, but they're still writing. So you put 2 and 2 together, and I put my hand up, and everybody clapped. They stopped and looked, and that was, I think, my beginning. The start of really, I'm one of you, I'm like you, I can understand.
It was just a beginning of feeling you belong to the place, yes.
By the time we'd got to the beginning of the 50s, there was the beginning of new migrations from Europe, and there was a huge demand for, in particular, Catholic education, because many of the migrants were coming from Catholic countries. So Rosebank reopens, all of a sudden you've got pupils who can come. I think the nuns reopened it with a new vigour and fervour because they changed the uniform.
Well, the uniform was all black blouses, black blazers.
Even going on school holidays, the instructions were, you girls, don't be painted like a letterbox, that's lipstick, and don't wear shorts.
Black hats, black stocking. Our sports dress was black.
from black and white to this resplendent royal blue and gold, most extraordinarily observable uniform.
It was a shock for me having to wear 90 denier stockings, I remember that.
It was very much a ladies' college, good manners, good behaviour.
Always on public transport, we always had our hats and our gloves on.
I think the girls felt a certain pride that they had this particularly outstanding sort of uniform, and so it got the school going again.
Sport, I guess, was the thing that made the impression on me.
We had 4 houses and they had colours and names, and the blue house was Rosario and I was house captain of that house. There was white, Immaculata, there was gold called Marion, and there was red, Sacre-Cœur.
We had to get up and play every day. Something. It was relentless.
Fridays was swimming day.
Used to go on the bus.
Used to go on the bus to the Drummoyne pool.
With our sports uniforms. Have bloomer inspection as we were getting on the buses.
We'd have lessons on how to get changed like little ladies, modestly in the change rooms.
The effect of legislation passed during the Menzies term was an effect that all Catholic schools felt. The government money brought the schools up to a level that they'd normally not enjoyed.
We had new buildings and classrooms, and there were science labs, and as a 12, 13-year-old girl I was just in awe of seeing a Bunsen burner.
What happened when Wyndham came in was that the very small little Catholic high schools around closed down. All these little schools that had small numbers were directed towards Rosebank. So year 7, 8, 9 and 10, expanding. I had to bring in new subjects, a lot more subjects were taught, and by the time I was principal in 66 we had a fabulous lay staff. These young teachers that all were bubbling and keen, and we worked very much as a team. By 1967 it was our centenary. I was principal and Sister Justin Simmons was the superior. We got an enormous tent in which we could have the centenary mass, and it went down in the courtyard behind the white building. Sister Justin was a great musician and therefore could manage Mr. Naylor to get an organ out. And then a great storm blew up. So Sister Justin and I went down and we covered that organ with everything we could find, and we sat and we prayed for about 3 hours while the storm was flapping all around us, trying to protect the organ.
I think Rosebank will maintain its integrity into the future by the past students that have gone through Rosebank. You can tell that they're well educated, self-assured. The confidence that any student gains by being at Rosebank can take you through life to apply yourself in any situation or any job position. If you've got the confidence, you can get anywhere in life.
It's just a lovely school, and it's a school where you knew you were coming here and you were going to be looked after and taught properly, and my years here were the most precious years of my life, and I think they taught me very well.
I think one of the reasons for that longevity would be initially the dedication of the sisters, and then as the years went on, the extraordinary commitment of lay teachers who worked under very limited conditions.
In 1973, Whitlam started the Australian Schools Commission, which was to give needs-based funding to schools. That meant that schools like Rosebank, which had a large multicultural population and were in need of specific aid to address the needs of those students, they were going to be catered for. So that was a huge thing. In 1973, Rosebank had a terrible fire, and it happened overnight, I think on a Saturday.
The first part I knew about it was a knock on my door, from my bedroom door, from a sister who was sleeping next to me, and she said, "Let's look out the window. I think there's smoke."
I was not pleased when I heard noises in the corridor at 4 a.m. Then I heard the school's on fire.
A number of classrooms were destroyed, and that included the needlework room and the art room.
What I remember about the next day after the fire was the response of the local community. A building was very quickly built after the fire and organised with the support of Father Delaney from Concord Parish.
Bernadine was a marvellous principal. She had a very dry but very real sense of humour. I remember as deputy, I started term 1. So I did the week before, doing the timetable. Suddenly, 3 days into term, Bernadine said to me, "Oh, I've got to go away this weekend. I've got a wedding to go to in South Australia. I'll leave on the Thursday and probably won't be back until Wednesday the next week." So he's me in absolute panic at the prospect of I've been here a week. And she says, "Don't worry. Look, only phone me if the place burns down." Historically in Sydney, many Catholic schools had been established and run by religious congregations. Everyone would be familiar with the Wyndham Report and the changes that brought to secondary, particularly secondary education in New South Wales. As part of that process, the Catholic Education Office dramatically increased the number of schools that they assumed responsibility for.
The widening of the curriculum, I think, was a response to the Wyndham Report, which wanted to encourage students right across the state to go to Year 12. An extra year was added on. That never happened at this college. This college went from 7 to 10 at that time.
There was a fair volume of disquiet amongst parents that the school, at the end of Year 10, had to send their daughters to alternative schools. And I think the volume of concern was increasing. Eventually, the decision was made by the Good Samaritan sisters to leave the system.
We were no longer answerable to the CEO. We were able to make decisions.
At the end of 84, there was an expectation that we would do everything possible to get 11 and 12 at Rosebank.
It gave Rosebank freedom to follow its own destiny.
There was real angst amongst the parents at Christian Brothers Burwood, which was a boys' school. By and large, they were having great difficulty finding Catholic schools for their sons.
Right from the word go, the parents had always had a great respect for the two schools, Rosebank and Christian Brothers Burwood, and they combined in a P&F to support the college in its early years. At first, of course, we had great difficulty because there was not the finances really to establish a full senior school. So I think the first year it was Year 11 that was catered for. And then next year we went on to Year 12. And it's just grown since then.
Those early years as a co-ed school, John Hawley was very significant in overseeing all that and in managing the huge building work that was required to accommodate that.
My strongest feeling of the time is one of affection for the whole of the college community, the students, the staff and the parents. And somehow the ethos was a lived ethos of being with them and working with them and wanting the best for them.
Preparing the students for the outside world is definitely the mission. The history tells a great story of John Hawley's leadership. He brought the boys into the school and the school was incorporated, all within about 4 or 5 years. However, John would be the first to admit that everything wasn't perfect. The school probably reached a plateau and wasn't quite picking up on all the vibes of the changes in education and the world. So when John's time came and he moved to become a business manager with the sisters, Alan Moran was appointed. There had been quite a few decisions in 2004 about changing the timetable structure and also the discernment around co-education. When Alan went on long service leave right at the end of 2004 and returned mid-January, he rang the chair of the board and for some reason decided he's not going to come back. And so the school was plummeted into this hole.
There was a really strong necessity to refine the supports that were available for staff in terms of their professional development to ensure that the resources that were provided for the school were appropriate for the time. When Tom began here at school in 2005, he really quickly showed his great strength of vision for the school.
And it was basically just to calm the community down, just to assure people that this was a great place, that there was built into the bricks and mortar and into the lives of the people who'd served the college so long, this amazing passion for what they were doing.
The school was in a stage when perhaps our enrolments with only girls was not as strong as we would have liked, and so we really investigated alternatives.
So faced with either returning to a single-sex school option or embracing co-education 7 to 12, we revisited the evidence around the impact of both single-sex and co-ed.
Looking at that educational research at the same time I was looking at market research, what we found was that there was a real need in this community for a quality Catholic co-educational secondary school. And that's what Rosebank was to become.
Just seeing these young girls and boys grow into young men and women who just work so well together. To me, it's a reminder how important it is to be part of educating the men and women to coexist, to learn from each other.
I think attending a co-educational school provides a lot of valuable experience and skills.
Getting to know and work with the opposite gender allows more experience and a better awareness of how to work with and team build.
We're presented with a real life environment.
If you're always around people just of your gender, you're not getting the broad view.
When you're both at school, it just seems more like you're friends and not, you're a boy and a girl.
It teaches you life lessons and you transfer on even after school.
The decision to go completely co-ed meant that we could most likely increase our enrolments. The response for co-ed has been enormous. We have absolute waiting lists just for parents to put their children in here.
I said to the board, you can't do this half-hearted, it's like everything, So let's rebrand the school. We wanted students to feel pride in their clothes and in their school. More importantly, they felt like they're going to work, that education was their full-time occupation and that they were professionals. They weren't just children, and they were doing serious work. And that work meant something to themselves, to their families and the world.
A lot of the teaching programs that we have are very student-centred programs, and we're living in a world where we've got 21st century learning and kids are very, very focused on technology. So we have to make that work for us, keeping the kids engaged and keeping them skilling up for 21st century jobs.
The school has adapted and continues to adapt. Its adaptability over 150 years has been extraordinary.
The support of the Sisters of the Good Samaritan has been enduring, and their pride in the school was a very strong factor in making sure that the school survived.
I believe that Rosebank's been around for 150 years because of the traditions that we have, and we have a strong sense of community.
It's a school that's given people an all-round education. It's not just academic, it's a whole life experience that they can carry forward.
We get new people into the community, we've taught them the same traditions, and that tradition is continuing. It's a bit like a family.
We've got a bunch of very, very dedicated students who are prepared to have a go at lots and lots of different things, and that creates a really, really strong sense of community. Things like the extracurricular and co-curricular program have grown to the point where we've got very, very strong sporting community as well. So there's something for everybody at this college, and community is a very, very big part of that.
We're always living in times of incredible change, and I think that change seems to be exponential.
We know that the nature of jobs is changing in the world. We know that industries are giving way and new industries are being created. And so in a sense, Rosebank has to do what it's done for the last 150 years. It has to hold on to the values, the sense of community, that sense of social justice, the things that are really important.
If the commitment of Rosebank remains to the students' flourishing, to their well-being, grounded in Benedictine values, then the future has every hope.